one of the differences that I have with much of integral discourse is that there's a very a kind of a preference for psychological, looking at these cultural structures or stages of development as primarily psychological, even though there's an emphasis, okay, well, it's I, we, and it, right? Or there's all these different ways. It's physical, it's cultural, and it's individual. That's true, and that's part of the teaching, which I recommend and respect. But much of the interest is in what psychological level am I at, right? Or I want to evaluate my employees to see whether they're, psychologically developed or not. It becomes very much it kind of gets caught in the self-help movement, which isn't necessarily bad, but what it does is it distorts the truth of what we're coming to understand about these stages of growth in a way that puts it into a cul-de-sac, because many important intellectuals who we'd like to influence see the psychological element of that and just think that's not true, right? In other words, there's so many people who have a traditional center of gravity who have fantastically developed characters, are the most, beautiful people you could ever meet, far more courageous and virtuous than your typical progressive postmodern person, and the same could be said for every one of these. So if we begin to see, okay, these are structures of history, they're cultural systems. They're made up of joint commitments about what is valuable, and that these systems interpenetrate people's minds, and people take them up in combination or more or less as they pass through life. But what is remaining, what is evolving here on Earth, are these structures, and so recognizing them as cultural structures helps us avoid the mistake of by default talking about people as though they're at a particular level of development, and thinking, even with all the nuance, inevitably the default thinking is that there's a linear a line of growth, and you're more evolved if you have progressive postmodern consciousness or you're using that cultural structure, and you're less evolved if you're using a traditional cultural structure. And that's both true and not true. And an important way that it's not true is that these are structures of history which interpenetrate our minds. And there are so many different lines of growth in our psychology that the tendency to oversimplify human psychological development using these structures of history as the gauge, you run into all kinds of problems. And that's one of the critiques that I have of spiral dynamics or much of what passes for integral discourse. Even though there are plenty of voices saying, well, let's not talk about people as being at. It's still the kind of the default thinking. And we can understand that and maybe be sympathetic to it, because this whole integral philosophy movement, for the most part, it comes out of progressive spirituality, right? It emerges out of the 30-year quest for alternative forms of transcendence that characterized progressive culture from the 1970s through, until fairly recently, right? So anyway, I'm getting back to your original question, and then I'll stop talking. The idea being that that these cultural structures which inform our values and give us a sense of identity and place us, along the timeline of history, so to speak, that these cultural structures are part of a holarchy. They're part of an evolutionary structure, and like almost every other evolutionary structure we can point to, the small parts are absolutely essential for the large parts, right? I mean, in any ecosystem, you have the whales, for example, and the plankton. If the plankton die, the whales are going to die. If the family structure and the values that uphold it die, the rest of the society is going to die, because it's an ecosystem and it's interdependent. And that ecosystem concept is at least one argument for why people can overcome their sense of animosity for those they disagree with politically by seeing the culture in this vertical dimension of development and recognizing how each person has an important part of the truth, and that ultimately the achievements of modernity and the achievements of traditionalism and achievements of cultures before that are absolutely necessary to the health and further growth of this overall larger structure.